The United States carried out air and military strikes against Venezuelan territory, including the capital, Caracas, and U.S. forces conducted an operation that resulted in Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife being captured and transported out of Venezuela. President Trump publicly stated that the U.S. would take over governance in Venezuela until a transition took place, including a plan to leverage Venezuela oil infrastructure and resources as part of that transition. This escalation has triggered international condemnation and has been compared to past U.S. interventions, such as the invasion of Panama in 1989. The U.S. government has articulated several official rationales for its actions. One of the primary publicly stated reasons has been the U.S. view of Venezuela as a hub for activities that Washington considers threats to U.S. national security, including drug trafficking. In late 2025, President Trump announced that U.S. forces struck a drug boat loading facility in Venezuela and carried out an extended pressure campaign against what the administration calls narco-terrorists. The White House claims that some Venezuelan criminal organizations operate with ties to the state. In addition to drug trafficking, the U.S. government has imposed sanctions and taken actions against Venezuelan and Iranian-linked entities for allegedly facilitating weapons programs and missile supply networks. Sanctions have targeted individuals and companies accused of supporting Iranian drone and missile programs via Venezuela, and U.S. officials have framed these sanctions as necessary for U.S. security interests. The U.S. political establishment has also justified pressure on Venezuela by describing the Maduro government as illegitimate or authoritarian. For years, U.S. administrations have criticized Venezuela for human rights abuses, alleged corruption, and undemocratic practices. These criticisms are part of a broader U.S. foreign policy tradition that views certain left-wing governments in Latin America with suspicion or hostility, often, especially when those governments oppose U.S. regional influence or align with U.S. adversaries. Another factor that has been widely discussed by analysts is Venezuela's vast natural resource wealth, especially oil. Venezuela holds some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. Many commentators and some policymakers argue that control of energy resources, or preventing those resources from being used against U.S. interests, is an implicit motive behind Washington's approach. Although U.S. officials do not openly claim that the intervention is about oil, critics and opposition voices, including Venezuelan officials, emphasize that resource control is central to U.S. ambitions. Venezuela's government has accused the United States of seeking to seize Venezuelan oil and other natural resources, emphasizing that these resources are central to its economic sovereignty. International reactions highlight that many countries view U.S. military actions as a violation of international law. Legal experts argue that the U.S. attack lacks authorization from the United Nations Security Council and does not meet self-defense criteria under international law. Scholars have called the U.S. actions a potential crime of aggression and point out that the U.S. is unlikely to face consequences due to its veto power at the UN Security Council. From the Venezuelan government's perspective, the United States has long pursued regime change. Venezuelan leaders and diplomats have argued that U.S. policy aims at undermining their sovereignty and controlling Venezuelan resources. In public statements, Venezuela's representatives have called the U.S. actions military aggression and a violation of their territorial integrity, declaring emergencies and urging mobilization against what they see as imperialist intentions. It is important to note that not all discourse about US intentions is grounded in official statements. Some explanations come from regional actors or ideological commentators who interpret the situation through lenses of anti-imperialism or geopolitical competition. For example, some critics argue that the campaign against Venezuela is part of a broader pattern of U.S. interventionism in Latin America. They compare the situation to earlier U.S. interventions in countries like Panama, Iraq, or Afghanistan, suggesting that regime change, often justified under legal pretexts such as counterterrorism or drug control, has historically been tied to strategic interests rather than purely humanitarian or legal concerns. The role of Israel in this situation is much less direct in terms of actual military participation, and there is no verified evidence that Israel is co-leading or formally partnering in an invasion of Venezuela. However, there are media reports and opinion pieces, particularly in regional or oppositional outlets, that suggest some U.S. pro-Israel think tanks or commentators have voiced support for stronger actions against governments aligned with U.S. adversaries such as Iran. One such commentary argues that Israel may have an interest in regime change in Venezuela due to strategic considerations, particularly if Venezuela is seen as providing support or political cover to U.S. adversaries. These analyses often point to Venezuela's historical diplomatic relationships with Iran, Russia, and other countries opposed by Israel, and suggest that weakening Venezuelan ties with those states could indirectly align with Israeli regional interests. It is critical to distinguish between verified policy positions and speculation. Official U.S. statements do not cite Israeli defense interests as a motive for intervention in Venezuela. Public Israeli officials have not announced a formal policy to invade Venezuela. Instead, claims about Israeli influence are often found in commentary or analyses by third parties, such as analysts who view U.S. foreign policy through a broader geopolitical lens. In international reporting, these positions tend to be described as interpretations or theories rather than confirmed policy drivers. Even in commentary that suggests a linkage, the reasoning is usually framed around geopolitical strategy rather than direct military cooperation. The argument goes that Venezuela alliances with countries antagonistic to both the US and Israel, for example Iran, could make it a target for those who view those alliances as threatening. These analyses sometimes overlap with broader critiques of U.S. foreign policy that see Washington's actions as serving both its own strategic interests and those of allies, but they stop short of providing evidence of a formal, coordinated U.S.-Israeli plan to invade Venezuela. The current international environment has also contributed to the narrative. Venezuela's overtures toward countries outside the U.S. sphere of influence, including Russia, China, Iran, and others, have historically been a point of concern for U.S. foreign policymakers. In a world where great power competition is intensifying, especially between the US and China, actions taken by regional governments that seem to challenge US hegemony can attract disproportionate attention and pressure. Venezuelan officials have repeatedly described US actions as part of a broader attempt to impose political and economic domination over Latin America. Some Venezuelan statements assert that Washington's ambitions extend beyond Venezuela, potentially into continental influence and control. Such rhetoric, while reflective of deep mistrust, has been echoed in multiple statements to organizations like the United Nations and regional bodies. Supporters of U.S. policy argue that the United States has a legitimate interest in countering criminal networks and narcotics flows that affect U.S. domestic security. U.S. leaders also frame support for democratic governance and human rights as part of their rationale for pressuring governments they deem undemocratic. However, these arguments have been met with skepticism and criticism from international legal scholars, regional governments, and third-party observers who question the sincerity of those motives and the legality of military force. The U.S. actions, including sanctions, blockades on oil tankers, and direct military engagement, highlight a deep divide between what the U.S. government states publicly and what many international actors interpret as U.S. strategic interests taking precedence over international norms, even within the United States. There is debate about the legality and wisdom of military engagement without explicit congressional authorization, with some lawmakers and experts noting that U.S. domestic law requires legislative approval for wars and significant military operations. In summary, the motivations behind U.S. actions toward Venezuela as of early 2026 are a blend of stated concerns about drug trafficking and national security, long-standing ideological opposition to the Maduro government, strategic interests related to natural resources and geopolitical influence, and internal political pressures within the U.S. that favor hardline approaches. Claims about Israeli motives or involvement in the situation are largely based on interpretation rather than direct evidence, and should be treated as part of the broader geopolitical narrative rather than as confirmed policy drivers.